Hello everyone, this is Ben, and today we're going to be looking at a Task 1 IELTS answer on a bar chart. This is the infographic. It's about telephone calls made in the UK over a period of 8 years, and you're given the data for every year. So if it goes up and down, for example, you know when it peaks, the figure. And the unit is in billions of minutes, made nationwide. So it's total number, total amount of time, total number of minutes. And as for the categories, there are 3 kinds. Fixed line is what we call a landline phone or fixed line telephone. So basically one with a line. I'm old enough to remember when everyone was still using those. Local calls, ones made in your area. So I'm from Manchester. In England, I could call other people in Manchester. National and international, again, fixed line, landline. I could call people in other parts of the country, like London. International, I could call my grandparents in New York, for example. Mobile telephones or cell phones, any kind of call, international, national, it doesn't matter. As you would expect, very clear rise in the usage of this kind of call. So as usual, we'll look at one of my students' real answers and talk about the kind of general score that this might be looking at getting. I recommend you just pause the video and read it if you can. I will read it out loud very briefly, but in a way it's better if you just read it in silence, in case I'm stressing particular words. I don't want to be doing that. So the first part, this is the rest of it, second and last part. These are the British Council's band descriptors. Public version, so available to everyone in the public, which is just people in general. Available for download from their website. If you're using your phone, especially, the text will be very small. So it might be better if you print this out or look at it on a big screen. But when I score it, I'm obviously going to zoom in, so you'll be able to see it even on your phone. So as I said, you can pause it, read it, and think about what score you'd give it. I'm going to read it very quickly now. Let's take a look. So the bar graph illustrates the amount of 3 call types phone call minutes in the UK between 1995 and 2002. Overall, it's apparent that nearly all types telephone call minutes saw increases in the given period. The only exception was the number of times of the local phone call. Looking at this bar chart more closely, one can see that the amount of minutes of the local phone call was over 70 billion minutes in 1995. The figure increased to 90 billion minutes in 1999, and then the number of this local telephone minutes declined slowly. On the other hand, despite the amount of the mobile phone call minutes was the lowest, the amount of mobile phone minutes in 2002 soared notably, and it was around more than 8-fold higher than in 1995. Meanwhile, the amount of national and international phone call minutes gradually rose from slightly under 40 billion minutes in 1995 to 60 billion minutes in 2002. And you can think about what you might give this, and then I'll tell you now what I would give it. And then I'll explain why. But overall, give this 5. Individually, grammar 5. Vocabulary 6. Cohesion and coherence 5. Task achievement 5. And 5 overall. Arguably vocabulary, I would give 5 rather than 6, but it wouldn't matter for the overall score. It'd be 5 each way. 5 either way, I should say. So let's look at it in a bit more detail. So the bar graph, is it a bar graph? Yes, it is. We say bar graph or bar chart. Illustrates the amount, well, it's really amount of time, isn't it? We say number of minutes or amount of time. So the amount of time spent on, I'll use the passive spent by people, makes it quite formal. The amount of time spent on 3 call types. Well, in minutes, but we don't really need to say that. In the UK between 1995 and 2002. And we're just missing the word of. But we've got call twice. So I'm going to delete the first one. So again, the bar graph illustrates the amount of time spent on 3 types of phone call in the UK between 1995 and 2002. 3 different kinds, so to be a bit picky, I might say amounts rather than amount. Let me add a small s there to make it a bit more precise. I'm going to make clear it's not average amounts per person, it's total nationwide number of minutes, so total nationwide amounts. Next part, so overall, so to give a general trend, it's apparent that nearly all types of telephone call minutes saw increases in the given period. Well, nearly all is a bit confusing for me because it kind of seems like 9 out of 10 or something. But there are only 3, so nearly all seems a bit weird. This is the part I'm going to maybe change the most. I'm just going to delete the whole thing. Apart from the first part, which I like, overall it's apparent that that's a good lead in. But the rest I'm just going to get rid of because it's going to be easier. So overall it's apparent that while the number of minutes spent on local landline calls underwent or saw or experienced a fluctuation over the period of 8 years. Running out of space a bit here. The corresponding figures for other landline calls, so national and international, other types of landline calls, and cell phone calls. I'm showing my vocabulary to the examiner that I know. Cell phone means the same thing as mobile phone. Sorry, not cell phone calls. Landline calls and cell phone ones saw a continual again and again each year on year increase or rise. Oh, just had enough space, just. Apologies for the messy writing, teacher's writing. But overall, it's apparent that while the number of minutes spent on local landline calls underwent a fluctuation over the period, the corresponding figures for other landline calls and cell phone calls saw a continual year-on-year increase. And corresponding there, it means the kind of the other matching figures. So it's quite kind of a useful word for task 1, I think. You know, the corresponding figure for France, if you're talking about the figure for the UK previously. I think I talked about that quite well. The student didn't mention there was a fluctuation up and down. There's only one fluctuation. It doesn't, continuously fluctuate. And the other two rise, albeit the one for cell phones rises much more dramatically, I suppose. Okay, so let's go on to the rest of this. Looking at this bar chart more closely, I think looking at the bar chart more closely is a little bit more natural. Other than that, quite nice though. One can see that, yep, good lead-in. It's not amount of minutes, is it? It's amount of time. It's number of minutes. Minute is countable because you say 1 minute, 2 minutes, but time is uncountable. You don't say like 3 times, you say a lot of time. So you got to get it right. So number of minutes or amount of time. I'd say on local phone calls because the idea is it's spent on. The number of minutes on local phone calls is not bad. Slightly better started at, because talking about the first year, 1995, and I don't want to keep repeating the same verbs. So started at over 70 billion minutes in 1995. Pretty good. If you look at the grammar band descriptors, you'll see they love complex sentences for grammar for the highest score. So I'm going to try to use one now. I'm going to keep going with the same sentence. One way to do that is use before ing. Before increasing to 90 billion minutes in 1999. In 1999, it's a bit confusing because it could mean it only grew in that 1 year. So I could make it a bit clearer. I'll just say over the next 4 years, like between 1995 and 1999. Over the next 4 years, or if I want to be fancier, over the subsequent 4 years. And then I'm going to keep it as part of the same sentence. And then declining. Thereafter. I don't know if I'd say slowly like the student does, because it's kind of at the same rates up and down pretty much. So I didn't say declining slowly, I just said declining thereafter. Thereafter is a useful word, it just means after that, but much fancier. My apologies, let me make that a bit clearer before declining thereafter. On the other hand, despite again, it's not amount of minutes, it's number of minutes. Despite the number of minutes for mobile phone calls. Oh, my apologies. I've kind of jumped ahead a bit. So on the other hand, despite the amounts, you can see that it's a bit repetitive, this. So it's confused me a bit. So despite the number of minutes the figure given 4, so the number 4, despite the number of minutes for mobile phone calls. Well, it uses despite, so the grammar's wrong. We don't say despite was, we say despite being. Despite the number of minutes for mobile phone calls being initially, so at first, being initially the lowest. And not just the lowest, it's a huge gap there. So I'm going to say the lowest by far. Same problem, it's not amount of minutes, but I don't want to repeat myself. The figure. Good trick is use past perfect with by if you want to talk about a change that happens by a time for this kind of infographic. The figure had soared, so that's past perfect. The figure had soared. Again, it's not really in 2002. We use past perfect and by. So by 2002. Oh, my apologies. Soared notably by 2002. And it was, well, I can use a complex sentence with a relative clause when it was, because it's a time 2002. 2002, when it was around you can say around 8-fold higher. But when we say 8-fold, we don't usually use it in that way. Not with higher. We usually say 8 times higher. And we say things like an 8-fold increase. Or the amount was 8-fold, that of. So 8 times higher. 8 times higher, 5 times smaller. 8 times higher than in 1995. Meanwhile, the amount of, amount of time spent on national and international phone call minutes. Spent on phone calls, really. That's the activity. Gradually rose from slightly under 40 billion minutes in 1995 to 60 billion minutes in 2002. Yeah, we don't have to say minutes both times. To 60 billion in 2002. Read it again very fast. The bar graph illustrates the total nationwide amounts of time spent on 3 types of phone call in the UK between 1995 and 2002. Overall, it's apparent that while the number of minutes spent on local landline calls underwent a fluctuation over the period, the corresponding figures for other landline calls and cell phone calls saw a continual year-on-year increase. Looking at the bar chart more closely, one can see that the number of minutes on local phone calls started at over 70 billion minutes in 1995 before increasing to 90 billion minutes. Maybe I'd delete minutes there, it's going to be smoother. To 90 billion over the subsequent 4 years and then declining thereafter. So before twice, before increasing and declining. So gotta get the verb forms right. And to continue from here, on the other hand, despite the number of minutes for mobile phone calls being initially the lowest by far, the figure had soared notably by 2002 when it was around 8 times higher than that in 1995. Meanwhile, the amounts of time spent on national and international phone calls gradually rose from slightly under 40 billion minutes in 1995 to 60 billion in 2002. So it should be a big improvement. Before the corrections, task achievement, I chose 5 because generally addresses the task. Sorry, let me use the highlighter, it'll be a bit better. Generally addresses the task. The format may be inappropriate in places. Yeah, in terms of the format, I kind of felt that there was a little bit of misunderstanding talking about the kind of overall trends at the start. How one fluctuates, for example, and understanding the difference between number and amount, which is also a vocab issue and a grammar issue. Number goes with countable nouns and amount goes with uncountable nouns. I just didn't feel I could say that all the requirements of the task were met, which would be a 6. Cohesion and coherence I did give 6, because I felt there was a sense of clear overall progression, introduces what it shows, the bar chart, gives an overall statement about it, even if it wasn't perfect, and then kind of analyzes it in a bit more detail, and kind of talks about the changes over time, which is probably a good way to talk about this particular bar chart, because you've got very clear trends over time for this one, much clearer than many other ones I've seen. Vocabulary, lexical resource is what it's called here. Just the choice of words. So limited range of vocabulary, minimally adequate for the task. Because those kinds of differences, like between number and amount, they are pretty important when you're talking about this kind of thing. But there was some good language that the student used. Like sword was quite a good one, just to give you one example. But overall, this was my impression. And lastly, attempts complex sentences, but these tend to be less accurate than simple sentences. Though there were some decent complex sentences attempted, but I just felt that overall they weren't used accurately. Like I said, despite would be with a noun or an ing verb. So the student said was, I changed it to being. And, there were things like that where they were kind of a bit distracting, I guess, for me, for the reader. You could argue that it could maybe be 6, but I just think it wouldn't be, because 6 makes some errors in grammar and punctuation, but they rarely reduce communication. I thought the communication was actually impacted quite a lot by the many grammatical errors. So anyway, these are the scores. And, as I said before, I was hovering between 6 and 5, but I went for 6 in the end, but it doesn't affect the overall score, which is 5. So thank you very much for watching and listening. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.